The chapter that we're going to be dealing with today is called UFOs called Cherubims. For centuries we've seen pictures of baby angels, so-called, on church windows, and old Bibles refer to them as cherubs or cherubims. So if you would allow me to question this for a minute, yes, it's all Greek, as they changed from the Hebrew and then from the Hebrew into the English, and then it was further corrupted as it came into our present language. Now remember, this is from archaic language, and we've lost the idioms, we've lost the etymology of the language, we've lost the understanding. So we find the Hebrew of Ezra 2:59 as we read, let's say for example, using a Farrar Fenton Bible, or we use a James Moffat, we'll find the word cherub. Also, we'll find in, I believe it's located in number 761's cherub. It's spelled different. Now, Strong's takes us to Exodus 25:19 and mentions others, as we shall list at the end of this chapter. But how they switch from CHER-UB, spelling it with the letter C instead of K. They didn't explain the switch. But when they spell it with a K, they send you a word or to a word in our Strong's Concordance. You may prefer others, but this is one of my favorite. You'll find they're listed in the Old Hebrew Lexicon. It lists word 3743, and it gives us this explanation. KERUWB, and is pronounced KER-OOB. My thought is on this that many scholars say that it's from an unknown derivation. So it is possibly then describing a sound, like a small child playing with a toy car, plane, or motorcycle. And he makes it sound like karoom. Were they sounding it out phonetically? Describing a sound as of a moving motion that was created by some source of power. The cherub, pronounced cherub, has a corresponding Hebrew in the Chaldean language, G-U-W-N, pronounced koom, K-O-O-M. Now, meaning in that language, as the lexicons and the concordance, they explain to us that it means rise up, stand up, set up, and they go on to say that it corresponds to G-O-W-M-A-H, and it's pronounced koma, height, or along. Adjectives describing the actions and the abilities of these, what I maintain, are cherub ships. Then Strong's, he switches back to KERUB as a place in Babylon. Did they also say Sinai was a place in the desert? Well, the Bible proved them wrong there also, as we'll be proving this in another chapter. So we just can't assume things and take them at face value, because it seems to change around and switch on us, so we have to follow it all the way through. It would seem that the Greeks switched from spelling cherubims with a K to a C, and we find in the Farrar Fenton and the James Moffat Bible, he uses cherubims, cherubs, instead of cherubims. Let's see what the scriptures say, and or how they describe their action. Does it just describe something mechanical, and or the man who fly them? We could cite you 3 different translations, King James, Farrar Fenton, James Moffat. They all have differing opinions. Notice how they switch from cherubims to clouds under the feet to whirlwinds, describe some fire. Then they speak of space stations as temples and a great empty or a clear space. So we see a lot of these descriptions are the same thing. They're described differently as the opinions of their translators vary, who have no idea, possibly, at that time what was really going on in this period of time that preceded them by centuries. So when they translated this, they tried to hide under the cover of spiritual, esoteric, or religious hocus pocus. So we find that In this day and age, we can't get by with this because we have what I call the Star Trek generation, and they no longer find this acceptable. They're turning away from the ancient books. We also note the word bow, as in the clouds, has been overlooked for generation as an insignificant word. We're going to see in other chapters how it is referring to what we would call heavenly warships under extraterrestrial generals like Michael and other archangels or messengers. If we appear to be repetitious to some of our listeners, it is for the purpose to aid those of you who are unfamiliar with the Bible or the subject. We find that the word rock and fortress have long been overlooked as something that I believe we can prove that flies. Here are 3 different examples taken from 2 Samuel 22. King David, he's trying to tell us of an extraterrestrial intervention on his behalf. Because when he was just a small boy, if we are to believe scriptures, it shows that he was chosen or pre-selected by some great extraterrestrial lord who decided that he was the one that was to indeed rule a nation called Israel. So let's listen to David's account and see if this great preponderance of evidence he gives, was he trying not only to be saved from the wrath of his enemies, but appears that he was taken to a space station in outer space. And who knows what he was taught. It was through the line of David that the Messiah was to be descended. So we find as we go to 2 Samuel 21, starting out with the Friar Fenton. Now this was approximately in the year 1018 before Christ. And David even made a song out of it, and he called it a song of thanks. David recited the words of this song to the ever-living. When the ever-living had delivered him from the hands of his enemies and from the hand of Saul, and said, Song of thanks. The Lord was a rock and a fortress and a refuge to me. Now a refuge is something that you hide in. And what was a rock? As we said before, and will be proven as we go along, was it rocket? Was it a fortress? Today, do we not call, or even during the Second World War, didn't we call some of the planes flying fortresses? So, I know this is new approach, but let's think about this. He goes on to say, God is my fort. I will trust in him. My shield, my buckler, and hold. Now, let's go away from the Bible for just a moment. We find in reading the ancient records of a book called the Book of the Dead. Well, a lot of people are not aware that every pharaoh that ever sat upon the throne, he wrote a so-called Book of the Dead, which is a title that has been erroneously labeled by Western man. But in essence, what it was a book of life, because all of those pharaohs believed in an afterlife. They believed they were going to cross a lake, many times referred to as a sea, which would be the lake or the sea of space. And they spoke of the flying shields of Horus. They spoke of the eye of Horus. And they went on to say that there was an eye in the shield that watched them. And then we're going to cover some of the poems that was written about this great Horus. They did not claim that he was their main god. They called him a god. They thought of him as one of the main sons of God. And it seems there was a family feud going on, and they took sides with Horus. But then when they grew close to death, they were sure to write in their diary, they said, as we pass back, taken by the shields of Horus, when we go back to the house of life. Now see, there's not much difference. Our Bible talks about the tree of life. And the symbology there has not been understood by people because we speak of family trees. And so there's very little variation there. But we find that recorded in the Egyptian history that this Horus, we will not argue about who he was at this time, but he was always at odds and literally at war with the sons of Shem. And we find that, yes, they spoke of that, but they also said Seth. And the Egyptians, who paid homage to Horus, they talked about evil Seth. But then when they got ready to die, they said that they were going to say to the great god Ra. That's what the Egyptians, they believed in one main god, but they had many other gods, just like the Egyptians passed it on to the Greeks. They had gods many, but some of them still believed there was one main deity. But as they were to cross the lake of death back to the house of life, they said to the god Horus and the god Seth, they said, remember, don't be mad at us. Our dog's not in this fight because we have the blood of both of you in it. So we find whoever these ancient Egyptian people were, that many of the pharaohs that sat upon the throne, they definitely had Semitic blood in them. But anyway, that's another story and a tangent. Let's go back to the Song of David. God is my fort, I will trust in him, my shield, my buckler, my tower and hold. Now we said that before, but you'll find here that tower is also referring to pillars. As we gave you a brief outline in one of our foregoing tapes, that we spoke of these pillars of smoke. And we find out that these great space platforms, we could call them many other things, but they were also addressed by those even more ancient than the Egyptians when we go back into the mysterious, ancient, archaic history of Akkadians, that they spoke of towers, occasionally using pillars. But anyway, David goes on to say, my Savior who saved from oppression. In despair I will cry to the Lord, and I shall be saved from my foemen. So it sounds like when David was out there hiding from the great armies of Saul, the ruler of Israel, and he was jealous of David because he knew that he was the rightful heir to the throne, that the prophet had said that he was the heir apparent to the throne. Well, Saul and his family definitely did not want to give up the good life. So here was David literally all alone. So he had to trust in this extraterrestrial personage we call God. But we might remind you that many Christians, when they learn what they call the Lord's Prayer, and their Christ taught them to pray, how were they taught? Not my God, which art in heaven or outer space. They said, you're to pray thusly, or he said, our Father, which art in heaven. So this is what we're looking for. We're looking for a more personal identity. Now, if your daddy is the governor of your state, you don't walk into his office and say, Governor, may I speak to you? That's rather impersonal. You're closely related. You're a kinfolk, and you can address him as Father. So it seems that David had a very close relationship, and I believe that as we get further into some of these tapes, we will actually describe the ships that he described, and we'll make it quite clear. It gives a description of these fantastic ships and from where they came and how they went. But back to 2 Samuel that we're quoting here, we would cite to you that the clue here in verse 1 in which David said he was delivered. Next question, I ask you a question, where? Then he goes on to tell the reader in verse 2, it said he took refuge or went into a space station. We'll see. How the translator called it a fortress and a rock, something up so high that they translated it as a tower. The translator could not conceive of a space station in their age, so you cannot read into the old books of historical accounts of UFOs without finding that they referred many times to them as flying shields. This is found in the records of many nations that we'll cover at greater length further down the line. Now, who else went to the rock? Let's look to Exodus 33:21 to 23 of the Farrar Fenton translation. Starting with the 11th verse here. However, said the ever-living, mount up to me, and set on the rock, and his majesty shall pass over, and I will take you in a cleft of the rock, and shade you with my hand over you, until I pass over, so that upon removing my hand you may see my back, for you cannot look upon my face. That seems very mysterious and hard to understand, but as we get along with the keys, it'll become quite clear to you. And you'll say, my, why didn't I discover this before? Because it's so simple. Even here we find that this Farrar Fenton, who I'm a big fan of his Bible, he got it wrong. Moses did not sit on the rock or fortress. He sat in it. Back to 2 Samuel 22, 5 to the 16th verse, gives us a clue from the Fenton translation. Verse 7 here describes this rock or fortress to a temple that houses this great Lord of space and his extraterrestrials. Apparently one of his watchers, now we're going to do a whole chapter on that, so bear with me. Anytime you think you're getting away with something, you better remember the scriptures are full of these people called watchers. And we were going to find out how David and many other people met them, but they said they had a job to do. They had to get off and off this earth. They had to go patrol the four corners of the heavens, so to speak. Now, let's see. Let us discuss verse 15. I believe that this is telling. We're going to cover this here in a minute. I'm just jumping ahead, and I'm trying to tell you what to watch for. I believe that David is quite clearly telling of rockets or an ICBM-type weapon and laser weapons, and David, he compares them to lightning. Verse 11, we're going to find it speaks of wings. I want you to watch for and listen so you'll understand when it comes up. In verse 10, it describes saucer ship. Saucer-type ships, let's say, as whirlwinds. In verse 9, mouth is one of the old idioms, meaning that somebody or he gave the command, sending forth his fleets of different types of ships. In verse 10, the idiom bent down, descended to this earth. Now let me quote it to you from the scripture, and hopefully this little bit of background, you may have to play your tape back, and then it might start to make sense to you. Then the earth trembled and quaked. What was this thing that was so dynamic that come down and it didn't say an earthquake. It said it made the earth to quake. This did it. The earth didn't have an earthquake of its own. It wasn't the platelets of the earth changing and shifting and moving each other. Then the earth trembled and quaked, and the supports of the heaven were shaken. This is referring to these towers. They didn't know how to describe these great spaceships. And it said, and quivered because of his wrath. A cloud was sent forth by his breath. We'll learn later on about cloud ships, these ships that fly in the clouds, and his breath sent them forth. Devouring fire from his mouth. Before him fierce coals were inflamed. He bent down the skies and descended. Bent down means like if you bend down to pick something up. In other words, this extraterrestrial vehicle bent down or came low to the earth. And darkness was under his feet, and he rode on the whirlwind and flew. He was seen in the wings of the wind, and he put on his covering of darkness, collecting black watery cloud, and bright streams of fire burnt before him, and thundered from the skies. Now, I'm sure that some of you hearing this for the first time are getting a little mental indigestion, and you're saying, boy, this old boy is really bending things. But I think for those of you that have the curiosity to follow through, we're going to do a chapter that we've entitled The Spaceships of Cathay, where the ancient Chinese, 200 years before Christ, there was an old Chinaman wrote a poem, and he talked about when the Lord of the Air came down to visit him, and he described them as black ships. Now, whether the ship was black, whether there was clouds around it, but I don't know if you've seen airplanes when they go into the upper atmosphere. It looks like the metal turns black from the heat change. We won't argue about that, but he said about when the great flying ship of the Lord of heaven, he who was able to span the earth in moments of time, who visited the 9 great cities, came down. He also described these ships as the great yin and yang ships. Not yin and yang, but yin and yang as they were described, because that also describes the motion of something turned circular. But we find very comparable accounts here, but going on. We're reading from the 15th verse. The highest, this talking about the Almighty, thus uttered his thunders, and shot lightnings, arrows, and darts. How can anybody deny that that is not some sort of missile that looked like lightning that came behind these darts? But remember, a dart here is a translation from the word meaning a spear and arrows. They had to equate it to something in their army and their weapons of war at that time, but they spoke of these darts and arrows having lightning connected to them. And torrents of water were seen as the base of the world was laid bare before the Supreme in his anger by the whiff of the breath of his mouth. In other words, all he had to do was whisper an order, and it was done at his command. Now we find in James Moffat 22:2, he refers to a crag, my stronghold. Remember, King James tells of Moses who was building, or was hiding, in the cleft of the rock or the crag. Moses' cleft of a rock was actually a room or quarters of a spaceship. As we're going to find more and more evidence that we go along, that the mount of the ever-living, as it passed overhead. Then in the 3rd verse of the King James, it's called a horn, adding to the confusion and adding another word or description. Was the old-time horn referring to a rocket? We will see. Another very, what I would call a neglected word is shield. There's quite a number of historical writings which describe these UFOs of their day as flying shields. See also James Moffat's Psalms, 18th chapter, 1-4. We can see how waves and floods and seas are an idiom referring to a great number of men, not a weather report. This is entitled, before the 18th verse, James Moffat puts in his footnotes here. He says, and the choir master's collection, a song of David, the servant of the Eternal, who sang these words to the Eternal on the day when the Eternal rescued him from the powers of all of his enemy and from the power of Saul. He said, O Eternal, my strength, I will exalt thee. The Eternal is my crag, my stronghold, my deliverer, my God, my fortress. That's the way they pronounced it back then. When I take shelter, my shield, my saving strength, my retreat. The Eternal is to be praised. I call to him. I am rescued from my foes, for waves of death broke around me. Floods of destruction burst upon me. Deadly nets entangled me, and fatal snares surprised me. I called to the Eternal in my plight. We find it in verse 2, David tells of being saved by the flying shields that take him into what? This flying fortress. And he finds shelter there. Psalms, the 18th chapter, is a second witness to the above. For Paul in Hebrews 9:5 in your King James Version, he knew about these cherubim ships that were described in the what they call the Holy of Holies over the mercy seat. But he went on to say we cannot go into detail for fear of, let me put it in today's vernacular, of, say, blowing the minds of his new converts. But he had to say this. And over it the cherubims of glory, shadowing the mercy seat, of which we cannot now speak particularly. The mercy seat, you'll find it's another expression from for throne, meaning he who rules from there. One of the last examples that we will quote is in Ezekiel, the 10th chapter, from the James Moffat translation. It describes these cherubims, or smaller ships, that shuttle people to the great whirling wheels that Ezekiel spoke of, that can hover over the earth. They can park in the great flying temple, as we will find it is described by some of the translators. It is just one of the 4 trips that Ezekiel took that is written down in the so-called book of Ezekiel. We find that a very exciting account that stirred me greatly. There was a man by the name of Plumrich. He was a NASA scientist and engineer, and in his book, he entitled The Spaceships of Ezekiel, he was a scientist who worked for NASA. But I think that in his book, he brought out some really wonderful points and a lot of mathematics, but he misunderstood the cherubims, thinking that they were gears on the wheels. If he had been more familiar, and this was not a put down of the man, if he had been more familiar with the rest of the Bible, I believe he would have understood it better than what he presented it. But then, of course, I'm not a scientist either. As we go to Genesis 3:24 from the James Moffat Bible, we find something very, very intriguing that most of the religious people and the churches and so forth that I've attended, they skip over this. They ignore it, and I try to get them to explain it to me, and I'll find that they all got to go eat fried chicken at some widow woman's house. But this 3:24 of Genesis and the Moffat, I found it intriguing. It talks about he. Now, a lot of people have the misconception that anytime you read the word Lord in the Bible, or where it's talking about he did that, it's not talking about the Heavenly Father. It's talking about those that are subservient to him, those that do his bidding. So we're, in my opinion, speaking of a pilot here, he said he drove the man out, and he set cherubims at the east end of the Park of Eden, with the blade of a sword flashing in every direction, to guard the path to the tree of life. Now, when I was a kid, I used to think, well, I kind of had a vision in my mind. There had to be some geographical location on this earth, and this Cain, after murdering his brother, he was driven out of the garden, and here I had a vision of the Almighty, with his robe hiked up and a switch in his hand, and he was driving the boy down the road. Because believe me, my grandmother has driven me to the house on many occasions using a willow switch. But then as I got to thinking about that, as you'll search some of the different translations there, it tells about Cain being driven off the face of the earth. And then we stop and think, which earth was he talking about? We have never considered that, most of us. But I believe that this man was driven out in something, and it describes it in the very next word here. He says it's a cherub. And then he describes the action of this revolving UFO or flying saucer, if you like. As it turns fast, it would look like a sword being flashed in a circle, or better yet, visualize your fan. One of these overhead ceiling fans, you turn it on low, and as it gets faster, it could look like a turning sword, revolving. So I believe here that they were equating it to something that they understood. And as we told you before, here they're speaking they were driven out of the tree of life. As we get further into our studies and research, we'll find that many of these other nations, including the Orientals, they referred to different planets as trees. Because I believe that was started so far back in antiquity, we've forgotten why they referred to them as trees, because on these different planets, referred to as trees, they had a family living there, a race of people. And many times we will find later in our studies that we can prove that these worlds were called a city. So the Egyptians referred to it, as we say, the house of life. And the Christian terms of the Bible is the tree of life. Let's go back for a second to Ezekiel 1 and 22. Here's where we find that a lot of people get confused by what is spoken of as faces that are on these ships, which I believe that we can prove to you without fear of contradiction that these were simply squadron emblems that represented the different areas of space that these patrol, let's call them, of watchers had come from. We're proving here, I believe, that Farrar Fenton understood, or maybe he just got it right by accident. Genesis 3:24 of the Farrar Fenton translation, I would like to take a moment and cover that. It said, he drove the man out, and he stationed them at the east of the Garden of Eden. Eden, the divine watchers with the flaming sword to guard the path to the tree of life. Now, tree is an ancient idiom. It means a planet or planets, that those were ruled over by Eden, which I think we will prove the headquarters was Venus. I call it the UN of outer space. And it talks about the trees that were connected to it. They constituted the garden. Later on, I know there's going to be a lot of people that talk about Abraham walking with God, and it talks about God walking in the garden. And we're going to prove, if they look up that original word in their concordance, it means to fly, and some sort of a vehicle. Now, Ezekiel's 10th chapter gives an account very much like King David's in 2 Samuel. And Ezekiel, he goes into greater detail. He gives us very specific facts as to what really occurred, I believe, in outer space and how they arrived there. The first two verses tell of a man in a space suit who seems to be in charge of loading the weapons or missiles under the different ships. Only the old translators call them coals. Were they a type of napalm weapon or laser weapons, rockets? The word chosen from the Hebrew is GEH-KHEH-LETH. This was from an ancient, unused root word meaning to glow or kindle. From the description, between the cherubs, he believed that they were attaching the smaller rockets or weapons onto the belly of the planes because of a word very similar. This word is another variation in the Hebrew. It is GAW-KHONE, Gawkone. This was probably from the external belly of this rocket ship. It is also related to another word, Strong's Concordance tells us, which is describing a rocket being fired. And that Hebrew word there is go, A-K-A-H. A prime root, they tell us it means to gush forth, issue, break forth, take out, and etc. Now Ezekiel, the 10th chapter, 1 and 22, have obeyed thine orders, he said to the man in linen. And I believe this is referring to one of the white space suits, very much like our astronauts wear today. And this primitive man, he had to describe it, I would say, as white linen, compare it to the robes that the priests wore in the temple. He said now in verse 2, go in between the whirling wheels under the cherubs and fill your hand with blazing coals from the fire between the cherubs, and scatter the coals over the city. Now, Ezekiel 10:3-22, they tell of the cherubs going to this rock, as sometimes called a space station. It tells of the great clouds that fill a space station from these great